assist kill. No! Oh god, I gotta get my script together. Okay, found the script. We're talking about the M4 Sherman. The M4 Sherman Medium is one of the most quintessential tanks of World War II. Next to tanks like the T-34 and the Panzer IV and the Cromwell and the KV-1. Oh god, that's such a long list of good tanks. Unlike most of its contemporaries, the M4 shoebox would last through time for much longer than World War II, seeing use into events such as the Cold War, the Korean War, and into the dang 90s. Wow. Sadly, that is a story for another time, as if I tried to get into that, this documentary would last over 50 hours probably, I don't know. Anyways, let's get into the beginnings of the M4 Sherman right now. Before the M4 Sherbet was ever produced, there was another tank which would serve as the basis for the M4, the M3 Lee. Midway through 1941, the M3 Lee was produced out of a very important need for a standard-issue medium tank to house a 75mm gun. Here's where things get confusing. You see, the M4 Herman as a concept was already on paper in 1940. However, despite the blueprints being drawn up, the military-industrial complex of the USA was not prepared for the requirements that were outlined within the papers, which will be discussed later. This urgent need for a new medium tank, especially in the wake of the Second World War, would lead to the M3 carbon monoxide leak being produced in 1941. Because of the rushed nature of its production, the M3 Leaf had a lot of problems. Let's go over the major ones, starting with the less than satisfactory position of the 75mm gun. Its traverse was limited because the gun was actually in the hull of the M3, which made it so that the main gun couldn't actually be used at all times. The multi-gun design of the tank was also a major problem, making it difficult for the commander to relay orders to the operators of the 75mm gun and the turreted 37mm. Also, just look at this thing. The M3 was 3 meters tall, which made for a very juicy target for the Axis anti-tank guns. Its armor was also lacking, but it's not as much of a problem as the other ones mentioned before. You know, it's a stopgap, you nerd. The M3 Weep was great for being a stopgap, with 6,200 being produced. The lessons learned from its production would eventually lead to the M4 Shopman's engineering time being vastly decreased, as well as making the M4 into a much better tank. The true story of the M4 starts with the T6 medium tank, also known as a Grizzly if you're a World Tanks player, but I don't think the Grizzly was ever actually used in a designation, so go Riot. The T6, being produced in early 1941, was the first running prototype of the M4 Sherman, and ended up retaining parts from the M3 Wee and, by extension, the M2 Medium. These parts included the lower hull, engine, gearbox, final drive, suspension, and the tracks. The M2, other than for the part commonality, is utterly irrelevant because it never, ever saw usage outside of the US. It sucked. These commonalities would make the M4 much easier on logistics and manufacturing. The requirements for the tank outlined in 1940 were as follows. The hull could be either cast or welded. The frontal hull armor would be at its maximum 2 inches, but it's sloped, so the effective armor thickness is a little higher. The engine was chosen to be the Wright R975 9-cylinder radial engine, giving the T6 400 full-grown horses worth of power. The most important part of the T6 was by far the turret, which could house 5 separate armaments. The turret could house one of these 5 things. One 75mm M2 gun with a 7.62mm coaxial. One British quick-firing 6-pounder high-velocity gun with a 7.62 coaxial. I'm just going to call it a coax. Two 37mm M6 guns with a 7.62 coax. One 105mm M4 howitzer with a 7.62 coax, and 3 12.7mm machine guns mounted for anti-aircraft fire. I don't know why they wanted to do the last one. Seriously, what were they thinking? All early American M4 Shermans were end up using the M2, with some of them using the M4 howitzer for infantry support. And no, don't ask me why they decided to name a gun the exact same thing as the tank which uses it. It's very infuriating and very stupid. In late 1941, the first and only T-6 Pilot was produced. It ended up fulfilling all the requirements that the Army had outlined. After it was tested, the following features were added or removed for production. The commander's cupola, which was taken from an M3 Lee, was replaced with a better cupola. The sponsor and doors on the hull were removed because it limited the effectiveness of the armor and the amount of ammunition that future production Shermans could hold. A rotating periscope was added to the turret, being located above the loader. The ballast machine gun got its mount changed to a ball mount. A 12.7mm gun would be added to the turret. And lastly, a gun shield will be added to the turret in order to protect the gun from splash damage. There were also some more minor changes, such as the different casting of the rear of the tank, in addition to a new exhaust, which prevented the T6 and the M4 Shermans from overheating. And eventually, when these standards were added to the T6, it would standardize it as... Alright, so from now on, I'm going to be taking it a little slower because I've recognized that I'm going a little too fast, but also I can't really change the voiceovers now, so... Sorry, not sorry. Anywho, finally, we can actually get to the M4 Sherman. It only took a hot minute. Here's a fun little factoid. The nickname for the M4 was a British designation. They referred to their American tanks by the names of the various American generals. The M3 Lee, M3 Grant, and M4 Sherman. Firstly, we gotta talk about the early Shermans from M4 to M4A2. The A, in this case, usually denotes a wave of modifications, which makes it different from the previous. A little bit or a lot. There's no in between. The M4 was the first... Wait a second. Wait, no, it wasn't? How does that work? Oh, whatever. The M4 was delivered in July of 1942 and had most of the same features as the T6 Medium. It's the only Sherman to not get a new M176mm gun later in its production. Its only variant would be the M4 105, which it's kind of self-explanatory if you paid attention. It got a 105mm gun in its turret, and it was for infantry support. It go burr. Well, anyways, onto the A1. The M4A1 was the first export Sherman, being delivered in February of 1942. It had a few changes from the initial M4. The most significant of these was the completely cast hull, giving the M4A1 a distinct, rounded shape on its hull corners. The bounce house looking tank. The gun was also changed from the M2 75mm to the M3 75mm, which offered better performance. In late 1943, the gun was eventually changed into the more powerful and confusingly named M176mm gun, which offered much more muzzle velocity, more penetration over range, and better performance across the board. This was definitely not the only change that would be made to the M4A1, which would now be designated as M4A176W after its new gun. The engine was also changed into a more modern variant of the Continental R975, the R975C1. The cupola got changed as well, with a new hexagonal 6-block layout with 76mm of bulletproof glass protecting the commander. Yay! Now here's what I think was the most major change to the 76W aside from the gun. The ammunition stowage. Okay, now it may seem a little weird, but hear me out. It got this watery, gelish coating around it, which prevented most catastrophic ammunition fires. This gelatinous coat was applied for every single 76mm armed Sherman. And no, it's not a death trap. Shut up about it, you idiot who reads a single frickin' book and thinks that they know everything! Ugh. What was I talking about again? Oh yeah, the Sherman. I think we've got 2 more variants. Actually, I'm looking at the script here, and sadly, we won't be able to get into the M4A3. I might do that in the future, so stay tuned for that. Shameless plug. The M4A2 was another generational refresh. I need to learn how to talk, y'all. Like the A1, the A2 didn't really see all that many upgrades, but it did see more. Rolled out in April of 1942, the M4A2 got another new engine and some extra applique armor on the sides of the hull and the turret. The hull was also welded like the original M4, giving it overall better protection because there was no weak spot on the sides of the hull. To be more specific, the engine was a General Motors 6046, which was literally just two GM 671 motor diesel engines just paired together and just slapped into a tank. I mean, if it works, it works. It didn't actually see much use within the US Army. Most of its usage was with other countries, such as Britain and even the USSR. Ain't that nice? There was also a refresh within the refresh known as the M4A2D. This variant got a refreshed hull with a massive 4 inches of armor, as well as some changes to the hatches it used. Other than that, it's the same tank. The M4A2 would also get a 76mm M1 gun and all the new things that came with it, designated as the M4A2-76W. There's yet another variant of the M4A2 which was used to test a new suspension system, dubbed the M4A2E4. The system that it used is known as torsion bar suspension, which uses separate springs for each wheel as opposed to the vertical volley suspension system, VVSS, and the horizontal volley suspension system, HVSS, which put two wheels on one volley. The new suspension system was deemed as unsatisfactory, and its field maintenance took too long. Therefore, this project was sadly cancelled. Now, let's move on to how it actually performed. The first Shermans to see combat were M4A1s, which would fight in northern Africa under British service. These tanks would fight the German Panzer IIIs in Tobruk, and both sides would take some losses. It was deemed as a great replacement for the aging M3 Lees and Grants with their very goofy look and very goofy performance. So yeah, Christmas came early for those tank crews. The M4s and M4A1s in Africa would eventually be replaced by M4A3s with their improved engines. They would serve until the end of the war. On the Eastern Front, around 4,000 M4A2 Shermans were sent to the Soviets, with both early and late variants of this Sherman. Half of those Shermans would be sent with the M176mm gun. The Shermans noted the low ammunition fire rates of the M4 in comparison to their T-34-76. And by ammunition fire rates, I don't mean the fire rate of the gun, I mean when your ammunition gets hit and it explodes, that's the fire rate. In this case, alright, let's not get caught up on that. However, the Sherman's high center of gravity would lead to higher rates of overturning and road accidents. I mean, just look at it. It's barely shorter than the M3. Did you notice the silhouette? Compared to the height, it's pretty thin. The thin chassis would contribute to the Sherman struggling with the rough terrain. Generally speaking, despite the issues, the Soviets liked their Shermans. Though, if you thought the Sherman was good in Europe, oh my goodness. You got another thing coming when you look at the Pacific front. The M4 was a menace in the Pacific for a menagerie of reasons. The only enemy that the US fought was Japan, so let's get into Japan. At this time, they were going through a pretty big resource struggle. That's the reason why they conquered China and Korea, because they needed more resources to fund their increasing military. The Navy, Army, and Air Force bickered over the limited resources of the Japanese Empire. Most of them would go to the Navy and the Air Force, leaving the Army without the necessary equipment for a war with a massive industrial power such as the US. As a result of the underfunded military, tank development was lackluster, to say the least. Most of their tanks were outdated models from the 30s, such as the Type 97 Chiha and Type 95 Ha-Go. As soon as the early Shermans showed themselves on the islands, the Japanese were pretty much screwed. In the later years of the Pacific Front, the Shermans proved their worth in the campaigns of Burma. Here's a fun factoid. Japanese tanks had very thin armor. Their armor was so thin that the Sherman shell could penetrate one side and go out the other, even with the fuse. Like, seriously. Context. Pretty much every tank at this time had a shell which would go inside the tank and then explode after penetrating armor, making its lethality really high. But those fuses were thickness sensitive, resulting in the fuses sometimes not detonating on thin armor plating. As a result of the thin armor plating on the Japanese tanks, crews had to switch to high explosive shells, which would absolutely obliterate the Japanese tanks on contact. As any nation would do, the Japanese tried to fight back. They made 2 tanks which would be pretty well known, along with a few goofy tanks which were never really produced, or like 1 prototype of them were produced. But let's not get into that today. Let's talk about the 2 major ones, the Chi-Nu and the Chi-To. Would you believe me if I said that they were both based on the Chi-Ha? The Chi-Nu had a bigger gun, and the Chi-To was like an elongated Chi-Ha with a even bigger gun, which even had an autoloader with 2 shells. These tanks wouldn't really fight on the islands that actually had to be defended. They would instead stay at the home islands of the Japanese, waiting for an inevitable US invasion, which would never happen. The US would never have to land at the Japanese home islands and sacrifice even more lives. As we all know, as opposed to that event happening, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The M4 Sherman is truly one of the tanks of all time. On paper, it wasn't the best. It got beaten out by tanks like the Panther, the Tiger, the T-44, etc. Even by its own American brethren like the M26 Pershing, which would be released in 1945. However, that's not really what made the Sherman a great tank. What made it great was its ease to repair, logistical support, and its immense versatility, which would make the Sherman last through time itself, and onto the aforementioned Cold War and into the 90s. Well, I hope you enjoyed the documentary. I'm pretty proud of it, and I want to make more documentaries like this in the future. It was pretty fun to edit at first, and it honestly got a little exhausting near the end, but it was still fun to watch it come together. Do those things that every YouTuber tells you to do. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. And also share it with your friends. By the way, if enough people like the documentary, I'll make a sequel which explains some of the other branches of the Sherman family, like the M4A3, which I glossed over, the M4A4, and tanks such as the Wolverine, the Priest, the... oh god, there are so many. Oh, why? Why are there so many? Why are there so many? Alright, goodbye. Have a good day.